And you're all very welcome, and happy International Women's Day to everyone. I've got some words of introduction, so maybe I will make a start, and then by the time our speakers properly speak, hopefully we'll have everyone in the room who's joining us. So welcome everyone to a really timely discussion on the role of women in climate diplomacy. It's a real honour to be chairing this event on International Women's Day in the year of COP26. As I said, I'm going to make just a few opening remarks before introducing our speakers and, of course, leaving plenty of time for audience questions at the end. And the starting point for our discussion today is the very clear point that climate change is a gender issue, that having balanced gender representation in climate negotiations is important for a whole host of reasons. Bringing more perspectives and views into deliberation and discussion leads ultimately to better decisions. For example, there's good evidence that firms with more diverse corporate boards, for example, perform better. Not only that, but there's also evidence that the public tends to be more willing to accept decisions made through a process that they can see is fair. And the inclusion of a diversity of voices, I think, is therefore crucial. And these arguments for increasing diversity, I think, take on a special significance for an issue like the climate emergency, where the impacts fall so unequally across not just gender, but also racial and socioeconomic lines as well. It's well recognised by the UNFCCC, the UN framework for the Climate Change Convention, that existing inequalities, including gender inequalities, are being exacerbated by climate change, by global heating. Around 80% of people so far displaced by climate change are women. Women and children are 14 times more likely to suffer the direct impacts of extreme weather events. And in many countries, of course, women often work in sectors that are most destabilised by a changing climate, including agriculture. So your position in society influences how you experience climate change, and creating effective solutions means ensuring all of those experiences are represented in the room. So gender balance in negotiations is important, but I just wanted to acknowledge as well the phenomenal leadership that has been shown by women since the inception of the UN framework on climate change. 3 of the 5 executive secretaries have been women. The current Executive Secretary, Patricia Espinosa, whom we invited today, but who sadly couldn't make it, also oversaw the agreement of a new gender action plan at COP25 to accelerate gender responsive approaches to climate action. And of course, Christiana Figueres, who along with Laurence Tubiana of France, was the chief architect of the Paris Agreement. And here in the UK, Amber Rudd, whom we're really delighted has been able to join us, obviously also played a key vital role in those negotiations. But climate diplomacy isn't just about what happens in stuffy rooms at distance conferences. So much that compels and drives these talks comes from the grassroots. And on International Women's Day, I think it's particularly important to recognise the amazing young women from around the world who are working tirelessly to put this issue at the top of the political agenda. And of course, that includes the phenomenal Greta Thunberg, but also people like Anna Taylor, who was so instrumental in the youth Strike for Climate movement here in the UK, people like Hilda Nakabuya, who founded Uganda's Friday for a Future movement, and people truly on the front line, like climate activist Milikini Falatsusi, who has been forced off her atoll in the Pacific Island by sea level rise. So the importance of women in climate diplomacy is clear. The initial announcement of an all-male top negotiating team from the government was therefore extremely disappointing. Fortunately, some progress has been made, though there's still some catching up to do. And that means sorting out the top negotiating team to ensure that they do bring the most effective group possible to COP26. It also means ensuring female climate leaders from across the world are heard in the run-up to and at the conference itself. So today I am delighted to be joined by a really impressive group of women, each of them with a unique perspective on the role of women in climate negotiations. First, Amber Rudd, head of the UK Delegation to the 2015 Paris Climate Summit, who also previously served as Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change before becoming Home Secretary. And she now works, it says here, in the private sector, primarily in energy and cybersecurity. Second, Lisa Nandy, Labour MP for Wigan since 2010 and Shadow Foreign Secretary. And she was also, of course, appointed Shadow Energy Secretary in 2015, shadowing Amber Rudd. And finally, we are still hoping to be joined by the Right Honourable Anne-Marie Trevelyan MP. She is the UK International Champion on Adaptation and Resilience for the COP26 presidency. and she also now holds the post of Minister for Business, Energy and Clean Growth. We've been warned that she might join us late. There's a visit of John Kerry apparently, which is taking her attention, which we understand, but hope she can join us. But without further ado, let me pass now to Amber Rudd for some opening remarks. Amber, over to you.
Caroline, thank you. And a huge pleasure to see you and Lisa again. Happy International Women's Day. My daughter reminded me that when she worked in Japan, they used to have a day off for International Women's Day. And she had mixed feelings about the fact that they were given presents of face cream and some flowers. Not sure that really got with the programme of International Women's Day. But it's such an important subject for us to look at today for two reasons, really. First of all, because climate change has come up the agenda like no other, and that's the case because of many of the women you've mentioned, but it's also the case because it's impossible anymore to ignore it. And the second reason is because, as you highlighted in your earlier remarks, it adversely affects women compared to men by some margin. So for those two reasons, I think it's a fantastic thing and an important thing to be discussing today. As you rightly said, I was honoured to lead the climate change negotiations in Paris just over 5 years ago. A lot of people sort of are kind enough to applaud me for the work I did. And I look rather guiltily at my feet at that point, because as is the way of reshuffles, I'd only in fact been in the job for about 6 months as Secretary of State before I was handed this ball. And I only had to walk it over the boundary, really, because to be fair, Ed Davey had done a huge amount of work to line us up to be able to help make sure that Paris was a success. It was interesting looking around in Paris to see what sort of gender representation there was. And it's also been interesting to see how that has evolved over the past 5-6 years. So there were a lot of women in the event, and as is so often the case in major negotiations, there are plenty of women in the event, often part of the negotiations, attending, but very few decision makers. So I took a look at the UN report before coming on here this morning, and apparently in 2015, only 9% of the heads of delegations were women. What is so extraordinary about that figure is that it had fallen from nearly 25% just a year earlier, and it subsequently went up. So I always feel that when there are small percentages of women in key leadership roles, it feels less painful if the general direction is upwards. And so we can say, not fast enough, but good progress type thing. But the trouble with the climate negotiations is that they have been up and down so much. It's really important to keep the pressure on. As you rightly said, there has been some fantastic senior leadership from women. You mentioned Patricia Espinosa and I think Christiana Figueres, and I would add Lawrence Tubiana. And there are a lot of international women who have really made this their cause. And it's been fantastic to see them in those senior roles. But we still have a problem with senior parts of negotiating teams being overtly male. And yes, the UK is one of them. You're right, they've addressed some of it, but nowhere near enough. I've got a letter, boasting moment, in the Times today, jointly with Claire Perry O'Neill, when we say that the UK, as hosts for this year's summit, should make sure that every negotiating team is 50-50 men and women. Now, the UN are the people, in fact, who decide on that. But by asking the UK to ask for it, we're trying to get them to put a marker down that it's important. It's important because when you have a disaster, and so many climate change issues will lead to more disasters, 3 times as many women and children are killed as men. It's important because women often don't own the issues that the men are deciding on. They are only affected by them. From a practical point of view, in Kenya, 99% of the land is owned by men. If you only have men at the negotiating table, only their interests are going to be met. So I would come back to the key issue of democracy that I know that you and Lisa share, but I think is always worth repeating, is that representation affects policy. If we don't have women represented, we won't have the right policy that considers their needs as well as everyone else's. So in this call for action on the Choosing to Challenge Day for International Women's Day, I think we need to keep up the call for making sure that women are equally represented, not only in government, although there's more to be done there, but also on key negotiating teams, or their interests won't be considered. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Amber. And fantastic to hear about that letter. I shall go and look that out. But I think that's a really great idea because, in a sense, the UK government, if it's going to champion that, has absolutely got to get its own house in order as well. And hopefully it will. And I think you also very helpfully reminded us that there's no smooth trajectory, that just because you've got a good number of women one year, it doesn't mean that that automatically goes on. It's something that we have to keep fighting for. So thank you so much for that. Just a reminder to people, if you notice in the chat, upvoting is going to be possible for questions. So please put those in the Q&A. There's a message in the chat telling you that, but please do put your questions in the Q&A, and then we can enable your video and microphone to ask your question. But let me hand the panel to Lisa. I'm really delighted that you've had time to join us. Thank you, Lisa.
No, well, thank you so much for this and for organising this event today. And I think it was Madeleine Albright who said that there's a special place in hell for women who don't support other women. So let me start by supporting everything that Amber just said. As two women who've stood on different sides of the political divide for some time, but are absolutely united in a view, A, that climate change must be tackled as a priority, and B, that women are an absolutely central component of that. I think if I've learned anything in recent years, it's that progress is not inevitable. If you want it, you have to go out and fight for it every single day. And it's welcome that after much criticism for the absence of women on the top climate team, that Anne-Marie was appointed to a critical post on that team. But what this tells me, the fact that we're even here in 2021, having to call out a government for appointing an all-male top team to deal with climate change, is that not only is the battle not won, but the argument is not won either. So I'm going to start today by just making that argument as we prepare to host the world's most important summit, about why this is nowhere near good enough. So first of all, it is doing damage to this country's standing and reputation in the world. In 1946, as women battled to be allowed to represent our country abroad for the first time through the diplomatic service, they were told they couldn't possibly do it because it would damage Britain's reputation abroad. Well, it's 2021 now, and the reverse is true. Not having women at the top table is damaging to Britain's global standing. Coming off the back of the women that Amber Rudd referred to, known as the Lionesses, Christina Figueres, Lawrence Tubiana, Rachel Kite, and others like Kate Hampton, leaders in philanthropy, heading up the Children's Investment Fund in Paris. And that stunning achievement to pull off a global agreement that began to set us on the path to climate safety. It just seems extraordinary that a few years later, here is the UK fielding an all-male top team. I was there in Paris. I was very proud to represent the Labour Party there and as the Shadow Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change, but I was equally proud to see Amber heading up those negotiations for the UK. She's right when she says that this is a baton that is handed from one to another. The road to Paris was long and it took many people to build it. But I cannot imagine a male Secretary of State beginning by thanking all of those who helped him to achieve so much on a global stage. And it was an important moment for the United Kingdom that we had a woman leading from us there. Fast forward a few years, and this really does show the UK in a very poor light. The second reason this matters is because it makes us less effective. As Madeleine Albright said, once women in power raise issues others overlook, they invest in projects others dismiss. And Amber is right to say that there are sharp divisions in how climate is felt, especially for women in the developing world. Shutting women's voices out of decision-making is short-sighted. It sends a signal that we take those concerns less seriously. And we know, because of the compelling evidence on the role of women, particularly in peacekeeping and diplomacy efforts, that if women are involved in diplomacy, those solutions are far more likely to stick. I genuinely feel that we owe it to those women who are standing up in far more difficult situations around the world, particularly in Afghanistan, where they know that if these negotiations are only negotiations between the men in government and men in the Taliban, then women's concerns will be completely erased. We owe it to those women to stand up and make sure that women's voices are heard at the highest levels. But thirdly, and lastly, I guess what I wanted to say is that I just feel that the UK is missing a trick here. If you look at where the energy is coming from in the climate debate, we've got an all-female leadership team headed up by Tanya Steele at WWF. We've got people like Ruth Davis, who have been very proud to work with at RSPB, who was honoured recently for her important contribution to this movement. The head of the Environment Agency is a woman. We've got rising stars of this movement coming through, people like Hannah Martin, who was just made an Obama Fellow for founding the Green Deal UK movement, and her colleague Fatima Ibrahim. We owe it to their generation to do far, far better and to create those openings so that these incredible women, these incredible activists can shine and can make the progress that we need. Now, it's true to say that there was a long road to here. The FCO held out far longer than other parts of government about admitting women to the top posts. Even still in 1972, women diplomats were told to resign if they got married, banned from learning top languages, banned in effect by the marriage ban from holding top posts. But since then, we've had only one female foreign secretary, who was Labour, and we've had only one female defence secretary, who was Conservative, as long as countless men, some memorable, some completely immemorable. We've seen progress in the civil service. We've got some amazing women in some of the top positions now for the first time, but still look at the bar that some of those women have to clear. Karen Pierce, deeply, deeply impressive, first ambassador to the United Nations, fiercely no nonsense, incredibly intelligent, intuitive, smart. But you read the media coverage of Karen Pierce, she's described as being known for her flamboyant style, for her vivid clothing, for her intentional dressing. I mean, this is just surely nonsense, isn't it, in 2021? And politically, here we are with 30% of our ambassadors as women. That means 70% are men, in case you were wondering, and one female minister in the FCO in the most junior role available. So I think we should do two things. We should insist on gender parity, and Amber is right. The UK has to show leadership in this in the run-up to COP26 and put forward proposals for our teams to be 50-50 split. And we should take far more seriously appointments at political and civil service level. I don't want to hear anymore this argument that we have to have the best person for the job. I'm the first woman to ever represent Wigan in Parliament. You cannot tell me that in hundreds of years, until I turned up, there has never been a woman good enough to do this. I came in on an all-women shortlist, and if that's what we have to do, then we should absolutely do it in order to get the top people into the right posts. And as countries from Sweden to the United States have recognised, feminism is a central plank of foreign policy and diplomacy, alongside a commitment to human rights, democracy and the rule of law. The UK needs to recognise that too. And lastly, Caroline, I'll just say this, 20 years after UN Security Council Resolution 1325 recognised the role of women in peacekeeping and security for the first time, and looking at this lineup for the most important summit that we will host for a generation, it is really hard to escape the conclusion that our generation has dropped the ball. Climate change is the biggest emergency we face, and the enormity and complexity of the challenge is breathtaking. We simply cannot afford to cut out 50% of the population from being part of the solution. So this is absolutely the place to start. I'd like to thank you for bringing us together on this day to make sure that we do. And just finally, to quote Stacey Abrams, that inspiring woman who made such huge strides on voter registration in Georgia and is really tearing things up on the other side of the Atlantic at the moment. She said a few years ago, progress is possible, but it is fragile. These battles rage on, and we've got to be on the right side of history.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Lisa. And I love that quote. she has been extraordinary and such an inspiration to so many. Those were both fantastic opening salvos, and I'm desperately looking at our Q&A box, and so far people seem to be very quiet. So maybe we can change the rules and say you don't actually have to necessarily ask a question if you're racking your brain to think how to turn your comment into a question. If someone would like to make a comment, then please do also put your name in the Q&A box, and we can bring you into the debate. But I guess just I could try and kick it off just by asking whether or what you think more we could do, particularly when it comes to making it easier for other delegations, particularly perhaps from the Global South, to have more women in those delegations. I mean, we can certainly lead by example, and that's the first thing we absolutely must do, otherwise we have no credibility or authority to be making the case at all. But beyond that, is there anything more? Because I guess a lot of this starts a bit earlier back, doesn't it? Lisa, you were talking more generally about the diplomatic service, and unless there's a kind of a tradition of women taking power and being in positions of power, then girls don't see it around them, and so in a sense it can sometimes feel quite a long process to get to the point where women are putting themselves forward for these kinds of positions. So I wonder what else we as a delegation based in the UK could be doing to facilitate and to support other countries to move in this direction.
I think, if I may, it is a UN thing, really, but I mean, we have we are hosting it, so it is for the UK could make some points to the UN about it. But I recall when I was on the Council of Europe briefly, there was a requirement for representatives to have, no, I don't think it was gender parity, but to have a minimum attendance of women, because then you would, in order to head off all men lists of groups. And it worked, obviously, because as the Labour Party are fond of telling Conservatives, all women shortlists work. So if you had the UN mandating to have if not a 50-50, which would, of course, is what we want, but a minimum amount to get some of those countries that turn up because of, we know why, because of long cultural histories with all male lists, if you could get them to turn up with at least some, then it would start. And the objection that people say to that is that, but there isn't the pipeline, you won't have them at the same standard. And the answer to that, of course, is I don't care. Just bring me some women, and that's where you start. And then we continue to press for it. But I think that, unfortunately, culturally, there are a lot of countries in the Middle East, in Africa, that would choose to bring all men and continue to do so. Interestingly, Eastern Europe is because a lot of them are newer democracies, are much better at arriving with larger numbers of women.
Thanks, Amber. Lisa, anything you'd want to add?
Yeah, just one of the things that's been playing on my mind recently is the first ever appointment of a woman, and an African woman, to head up the World Trade Organization. And one of the things that the flurry of media coverage that surrounded that prompted African leaders at the United Nations to have to call out the racist and sexist way in which that appointment was covered in media coverage. I mean, these are the things that do, whether we like it or not, put women off from going for those top positions. The first question I always get when I talk to women's groups trying to encourage them to stand for Parliament is, what does it mean for your private life? How will you be covered? How much will you be attacked on social media and in the media? And is there anything that you can do about it? And I guess my answer is always, well, you'll find lots of us who are willing to stick up for each other in that world. But that goes back to Amber's point, is that you have to have a few of us there in the first place. And actually, since I've been in Parliament, it's been women of all political parties, including both of you, and including women in the Liberal Democrats and the SNP and other political parties who've come forward at times when I and others have been criticised for what we look like or how we speak, held to double standards around those things, and called that out. So I think it really matters. I think you have to start somewhere, and you just have to start push and push and push, and it gets easier when there's more of you in the room, because then you're not the only person pushing in the room and made to feel like a bad smell. So I don't have any better answers, except that we have to push for quotas, we have to push for we have to support other women when they champion this cause, and we have to push men to champion this cause as well. I guess one question I had for Amber, sort of based on the, we were on opposite sides in Paris in terms of politics, but we were absolutely on the same side in terms of what we wanted to see happen in terms of climate change. I guess one question I had was, do you feel that women being in those rooms really does make a difference? Have you seen examples of that, in the corridors of power, for those of us who've been in opposition forever?
I think that there is a special bond with which women reach out for in each other. And I think that you get the benefit of that in diplomacy, as Caroline, I think, was alluding to. And you get that in negotiations like in Paris. There's, you look across the table and you see, Julie Bishop from Australia, or Catherine McKenna from Canada. And these are the names that come immediately to my mind, because there is a sort of sudden connection you make quite quickly as women, which you can then, they may turn out to be not such good friends after all, but because I think it's something to do with being in a minority, as well as just women having a sort of interest in each other, that creates that ability to communicate. But you layer on to that the fact that women are more likely to reach a consensus, although obviously there are some very notable exceptions to that. But then I think if you layer onto that, you have a better chance of reaching an agreement. They are, in my experience, when I saw those negotiations taking place, it tended not to be the women who would flare into anger.
I think it's so difficult, isn't it, these conversations, in the sense that no one wants to kind of say that the women are intrinsically this way or that way. But I really remember a meeting that Christiana Figueres did, I think on an International Women's Day, actually, in London. I was in the audience and she was talking about the Paris process. And I was really struck by, for want of a better phrase, the emotional intelligence that she kind of brought to that. And she gave the example of how, and she was very upfront about it, which is why I'm very happy to repeat it, but she was talking about the fact that she herself at that point, I think, was going through a divorce. And so she was feeling incredibly vulnerable and very aware of how you never are going to get any kind of agreement unless both parties, or all parties around the table, feel that they've got something out of the process. And there was something about her willingness to expose that level of personal, personal situation that just felt really, just cut through all of the kind of posturing and so forth. It felt incredibly powerful in a way. I'll just look at some things in the Q&A. So I'll just pass on this question, a very quick question from Liz Reason. Does anyone know the criteria used by government when establishing its team? Do we know how our own government ended up with a...
I think you've got to be a man, haven't you? Looking at the all-male shortlist at the end.
I think that, well, of course it moved, didn't it? Because initially Alok was doing it as part of being business secretary. And a number of us, particularly if you're a conservative, made a few unpopular interventions saying this is ridiculous. It's got to be a job for one person, not an and when you're business secretary and we're coming out of the EU. There's only so much a man, let alone a woman, can do. And so he was, I understand he was given a choice and chose to be president of COP, which is great. And then it falls into ministerial roles, does it not? So that comes back to how you appoint your cabinet and whether you are appointing a team and you think about, I need different skills, different types of people, or whether you're appointing on the basis of who knows what.
Yeah. Can we bring Georgia Taylor into the room to put her question? You're still there, Georgia. I understand there's some magic behind the scenes that should mean that you suddenly appear. Maybe you need to click accept if you've been moved. Otherwise, I can just read it. Aha. Marvelous. Are you there, Georgia? I think you're on mute.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you. Well, I was just wondering why we're not looking at this as an all-party effort, a cross-party effort, since it's so important and such a, it's got such global importance. And I did wonder whether you, Caroline and Lisa, what you would say if you were invited onto the team. Obviously, Amber's already got the experience as in the party, so could easily be invited. But yeah, would you agree to join the team?
I shall hand that to Lisa first.
Well, speaking as someone who stood for Parliament 11 years ago because I was so incredibly frustrated at being on the outside and not being able to make change quickly enough, if I were offered a post on that negotiating team at COP26, I would already be there, ready to roll my sleeves up and start trying to make progress. I do genuinely believe this is one of those areas in politics where you can work cross-party. I think social care is another where those efforts have fallen off in recent years. But actually, I think foreign policy more general absolutely should be one of those areas where we do work together. Of course, we're not going to agree on everything. I mean, we still all bear the scars of the negotiations over, the discussions about whether we're in the EU or not. But nevertheless, although we will disagree on many things, what we should all agree on is that we want Britain to be safe, we want Britain to do well, we want Britain to play a positive role in the world. And while we might disagree on how you achieve those things, or even at times what those things are, this should be an area where it's possible to build a cross-party consensus. So yes, I absolutely would. What do I think the chances of me being asked to do that are? I'd say pretty much zero, although probably slightly higher than Amber being invited back to play a role. I think there is a real difficulty at the moment. I'm saying this not as a party political point. I don't think that it would have been the same in the Theresa May government, and I don't think it would have been the same in the Cameron government. But I think there is a particular difficulty at the moment with a government that doesn't particularly want to reach out and work cross-party. I'm sort of being diplomatic here, and actually doesn't particularly want to reach out and work with other parts and traditions of its own party. And I think we've got a problem when it comes to these big areas where you do need cross-party consensus to move on. It's not something, I won't give up trying. And I don't absolve the Labour Party from any criticism around that either. I think in recent years we had become very, very tribal, which was something that was of dismay to me. And I think we started to move again and started to try to work with the government on things like COVID-19, where we can support to try and get the country through this crisis. But this is a bigger point, I suppose, really, about we go through these ebbs and flows with different governments about whether they're prepared to work cross-party or not. And at the moment, I think we're in a pretty dire place around that, but I hope that it'll get better.
Thanks, Lisa. And I guess my answer to that would be, yes, I would certainly accept the challenge. Whether or not I would be allowed to stay there for very long, I'm not sure. But I suppose just to put a bit of grit in the oyster, just so that we're not agreeing with everything, I suppose one thing that does frustrate me a little bit is the assumption sometimes, and people say it, that climate change is above party politics. I agree that climate change should be above party politics, given that it is such a matter of existential life and death. But actually, when you look at the details of what we need to do to tackle the climate emergency with the speed and urgency that's necessary, then it does actually come back into some quite deeply political decisions in terms of who pays the price and what the transition looks like and so forth. So sometimes I get frustrated when it's kind of assumed to be an issue that is so obviously one that concerns us all, that we will therefore all sign up to the same prescriptions, because clearly we don't. But Amber.
Caroline, I think that neither of the major parties would ever be doing it to your satisfaction, I'm afraid. But you are a great leader in this area, and we all try to keep up. But I would say that the UK is unusual in that it does have a cross-party agreement with the Climate Change Act. And the Climate Change Act was passed under a Labour government, of course, but it was made more ambitious because of Conservative lobbying. And it is unusual. A lot of countries have parties that take a completely different view to each other on how to address climate change. And we have the legally binding agreement of that act and the carbon budgets, which each climate change secretary or business secretary, whoever's having to be the opposite number on it, has to account for, and will be taken to court if it's not fulfilled. So I think that we should be quite proud, in a way, of the fact that there is a cross-party agreement, there is a legislation in place to enforce it, and we don't have the same difficulties, say, in America, where they swing in and out of the Paris Climate Change Agreement for once. That can go on in other countries as well, but not in the UK. Just to remind ourselves what the UK's role is in this year, hosting COP, where Alok Sharma is the president. So he's not supposed to be partisan at all. He is the COP president in the same way that Laurent Fabius was in Paris 5.5 years ago. And then under him are the energy ministers and the business minister, who are the lead ministerial team, just as Ségolène Royal was 5.5 years ago. She had actually very little role to play within the success of Paris. She was just one other country representing her country's interests in the final negotiations. The key element was the management of the COP, to make sure that all the parties were considered and taken seriously and felt involved, and then the sort of crunch moment at the end. And the French did it incredibly well, basically withdrawing heat, food and hot drinks for the last 36 hours. So we were longing to get out. That was what you call a forcing mechanism in the language. So I hope that we have something like that in Glasgow in November.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, Georgia, so Lisa and I are on our way up to Glasgow. Nikki Gavron is in the chat. I don't know if we can move her. There's a question there from Nikki, Assembly member, which would be lovely to have. And I don't know the technology well enough to know whether or not the fact that I think it's fine, but you can move her across. Yes, here we go. So Nikki, do please put your question once you are able to unmute. If you're able to unmute, there should be a button. Okay,
yeah, no.
Yay, thank you.
Fine. Okay. Sorry, I'm just going to be, I haven't got enough bandwidth for you to see me, but thanks. I just wanted to, first of all, I want to salute you three wonderful women on our platform. Thank you so much for this session. It's really, really important. I've been to a number of COPs representing city networks, notably the C40, and what happens there is you're given one day alongside civil society to make your representations, but of course, and all the different nations are there listening, but it's not being in the negotiation, and indirectly or directly, cities are responsible for so much of the climate change impacts, that it seems to me that although international agreements, and of course they are absolutely crucial, but when it comes to practical action, then I think cities are really centre stage, and to a certain extent the battle against climate change will be won or lost by cities, and therefore, and of course they work very closely with civil society, and I'm therefore interested to know whether you think it would be a good idea for cities, and a lot of the leadership is women and ditto civil society, whether you think that it would be a good thing to involve cities in negotiations alongside nations.
Brilliant, thank you. Amber, do you want to do that one first?
I think, hello Nikki, nice to hear from you, if not see you, and I'm aware of your leadership in this area too, which is great. I think that cities have already played an important role. I mean, I can only go on my own experience, but having city representatives at a really important COP like the one we had in Paris and taking place this year is all part of the driving need for compromise from all the decision makers so that we actually get a deal. So I recall the way cities were there and the way various NGOs were there. And I think constituent parts of a country, citizens, cities, nations in America, the different states, play an incredibly important part in legitimizing the ambition of the country leaders to try to get a deal. I'm a trustee of the Climate Group, which does important work trying to make sure they work with cities and with states in the US and sort of non-governments, anything below governments, to try and get them to make the changes which help inform the governments to get the decisions in place. So they play an incredibly important role.
Lisa.
Yeah, I mean, thanks very much, Nikki, for everything that you've done on this. And I do agree, actually, that the role of cities and world mayors has been incredibly central to all of this. You only have to look at the United States and the experience of recent years, where you had a president who, on the face of it, was, you know, he's withdrawing from the Paris Agreement. He was employing climate skeptics, and he was rowing back on the progress that had been made. But nevertheless, the United States, it was still very easy to find willing partners who were helping to help us make progress towards climate safety, because when you went to state level, that is exactly where the action was actually happening on the ground. So I absolutely agree with you that there should be more centrality given to city leaders, mayors and others. When I was at Paris, it was, you know, it was often the mayors of Rio, New York, Paris, London, who were making agreements about how they could move in step around this, and how they handled the fairly tricky issues around things like global competition and making sure that their cities didn't lose out as a consequence. There was some really innovative work happening, but it was happening on the fringes of the conference, which you know, you had the sort of global statesmen or women over here, and then you had the city leaders over there, and then you had the NGO sector outside. And it seems to me that we could do far more to bring those things together. But just to bring it back to the sort of subjects of the day on International Women's Day, one of my concerns is that, as somebody who firmly believes in devolution and believes that the closer that decisions are made to people, the more likely they are to stick and progress is to be made, is how little progress we've managed to make in terms of gender parity at city and town level here in the United Kingdom. You know, if you look at most of the mayors, they're men. If you look at most of the city leaders, they're men. If you look at most of the town leaders, they're men. And you have to go to civil society level to see women every day acting as leaders in their own communities and in their own areas. So I think this is the next thing that we absolutely have to crack. So I guess in a nutshell, absolutely, yes, let's make devolved regions, mayors, cities far more central to our efforts to tackle climate change. But let's not forget that until we start to make those cities and regions and towns far more representative of the general population, all we'll be doing is devolving decisions from one group of men in Westminster and Whitehall to another group of men in the town hall. And that doesn't feel like the progress that we need to me.
Fantastic. Thank you, all three of you. Thank you for the question as well, Nikki. I was going to suggest that if we could get Anne Toms into the room. She's got a question about education, but because it takes a little time to oh, it hasn't done this time. Marvelous. Okay, so this time we will go straight to Anne Toms, and then afterwards I was going to come to a question on business. But if Anne is with us, that would be perfect.
Yep, can you hear me? Hopefully you can hear me. So
Okay.
really, I've really enjoyed the discussion so far. So basically I work for Budweiser Brewing Group, and it's probably the most diverse environment I've ever worked in. But as a mother, I'm also very conscious of what my daughter's growing up with. So my question is about the role of education in terms of giving young women confidence. There's a lot of evidence that young women, their confidence starts plummeting at 8-year-old, which just seems crazy. It seems when they should be really full of confidence, but there's evidence that in terms of schools, that's when they start kind of losing their confidence. And then as they become teenagers, they lose their confidence in STEM subjects in particular, which seem to be kind of fundamental to understanding a lot of climate change issues. And so it's, what can the Department of Education do to kind of help deal with this? I know as a mother you can only do so much, and as a father you can only do so much. But it's, if we do want young or if we want women leaders in the future, on climate change in particular, we've got to start really as young as possible, I think. So
Thanks,
it's such a good point. And it does seem to me, though, the Department of Education for the past few years has had initiative after initiative on STEM to try and get girls involved. But I think just as important as that is what Lisa referred to previously, is about leadership. They have to see other women out there engaged, winning, participating and being heard. And I think that, I mean, the older I get, the more important I think it is for young women, girls, to see that this is something that they can do too, because they see other women out there doing it. So I think the more the rest of us can do to get out and advocate, but the Department of Education is having has a lot of initiatives to try and encourage women in STEM.
Thanks.
And I just add to this, I could talk all day about this, but the trouble is we do talk all day about it in politics, but we haven't managed to crack it. And I guess there's two things for me that I see happening back at home quite a lot. The first is that young people, young women, and particularly young women from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, they are born into families that have as much ambition for them and their lives and their futures as any other family in Wigan. And then what tends to happen is that somewhere around the age of secondary school, that seems to be somehow drummed out of them. Now, I don't think that's a question of people losing ambition. I think that's exactly what Amber was talking about suddenly, somehow, the system comes together and says, well, look at what's happening. How could you get there? Where is the pathway to get there? Who looks like you? Who does the things that you dream about and that you're fighting for? And somewhere along the way, that really falls off. I guess then what then tends to happen is that around sort of exam age, a lot of those young women have enormous amounts of pressure heaped on them. They tend to be the people in their school on whom a lot of hopes rest for good exam results. And so they come under increasing pressure. And at exactly the same time, they're coming under increasing societal pressure around what they look like and the expectations on them, particularly around their bodies and their images. Jo Swinson did a brilliant amount of work on this in the coalition government when she was a minister. So I think there's a few things that you need to do. I guess the first is, I think there's a really big role for business in all of this. Every time I meet a business in my constituency who are talking about apprenticeships, I ask them how many of them are young women, and it's usually 1 or 2 out of about 20. Now, I'm not saying those businesses don't do a lot to encourage young women, but I think we ought to start looking at quotas as well around that. And also just that I think we have to make young people, you know, when we educate young people about what it means, you know, about things like citizenship education, what we're not great at doing is helping young people know what it feels like to hold power. And there's a programme that I absolutely love called the UNICEF Rights Respecting School programme that Caroline's heard me bang on about this many a time. She's laughing, but they do it in my constituency with kids as young as 5 in some of the schools. And it's about getting kids together to start making joint decisions about the way in which their school is run. I'm not saying they give 5-year-olds the chance to balance the budget or, you know, set exam results and so on, but they will bring them together to make decisions about new play equipment, for example, and have a debate about that and put forward their arguments and think about other people and think about the trade-offs and make a collective decision at the end. And it is the most inspiring thing that you see, because what those young people learn is that democracy is hard. There are lots of trade-offs. You don't always get what you want. You have to think about things you didn't think about in the first place. But actually, in the end, you get better decisions through that process, and they are absolutely the people who can do it and who can be trusted to take that level of responsibility. So there's something for me about power here that we miss most of the time in the United Kingdom, about handing these young women power at the right age and helping them understand how to use it, so that by the time they're, I don't know, Greta Thunberg's age, they're ready to step out and do that and show that leadership as well.
Thanks, Lisa. That's brilliant. And that programme does sound, every time you've spoken about it, I've thought it sounded amazing. So so thanks for sharing that one again. You touched on business there. So I was going to just put the question from Karen Boswell to Amber as well, which was basically, what role can business leaders do to support this lobbying? And I think the lobbying she means is around women and climate in particular.
So I think that one of the things they can do is be aware and make sure that when they are making decisions about groups or promotions or involvement, they're thinking about it. I recall my own experience when I first became Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change, asking for a round table of business leaders who were representing the energy within their department, within their whole area. So it wasn't the chief executive I wanted to see whoever was responsible for the energy bill and stuff. So I arrived, like all Secretary of States do, sort of from one meeting to another, went into this meeting of 15, 20 people, all men. And I said to my office after, I took the meeting, but I couldn't ask them to leave. But I said to my office afterwards, we are never doing that again. You've got to make sure that we've got a third, if not half, of women in the room. And from then on, we did. And there was pushback. It's like, well, there might not be them. Or in fact, the answer I particularly liked was that we did have 2 women leaders who were supposed to come, but they had better things to do. I'm like, oh, well, okay, that's not unreasonable. But generally, I think that whoever's in charge of the meeting, the proposal, the initiative has got to be aware and got to say it's not okay to have all men, just as it wouldn't happen, but it wouldn't be okay to have all women. You've got to have a mixed group for a properly informed team. That's what business leaders can do.
Brilliant, thank you. Sorry, I think we've probably got time for one more question, and I'm going to take Syed Ahmed, who's just come in, who has asked me to read this out because there are kids shouting in the background. They're not back at school yet. And the question is, as major decision makers in households purchasing as major decision makers in household purchasing, the government did try with the Green Deal to bring in the voice of women, establishing a Green Deal Women's Panel. The Committee on Climate Change recent 6th Carbon Budget report highlights that net zero cannot be met without major behavioural change on climate taking place. Is it time to consider such a panel again? I must admit I'd forgotten that when the Green Deal was brought in, which was about home insulation and so forth, the government did bring in this Green Deal Women's Panel. And so the question is whether or not it is time, given that so much of the changes that we're going to need to make in order to address the climate challenge are behavioural ones, do we need a Green Deal Women's Panel, that kind of thing, again? Was that clear enough?
Yeah.
Good. I can't remember who went first last time. I'll come to Lisa. I think it was.
And well, I think it's a good idea. I'd forgotten about that as well, actually. And I think it is a good idea. But I guess what I would add to it is that women are, in every survey, women are far more attuned to the challenge posed by climate change, far more concerned about inaction on climate change, and far less likely to be climate skeptics. And that's as true in the UK as it is across the world. So there is something more radical that you could do if you wanted to make sure that when households are making purchasing decisions, that they're far more they give far more priority to environmental considerations, and that is to make sure that women aren't stripped out of being the chief breadwinners, the highest earners, the biggest spenders in their households. So there are big questions about the way in which the benefit system, for example, has developed over recent years, and the way in which women are often not thought about in those considerations. For example, bringing in a primary benefit claimant in a household, which disproportionately cut women out of spending decisions in their own households. It seems to me that if you're serious about making sure that households can make greener decisions, putting women at the heart of being able to make spending decisions and have economic independence in this country, that is a much more comprehensive way of running green issues like a thread through the spending decisions that households are making. I guess the only other thing I would add to that as well is that I've always been very uncomfortable about this idea that we place a kind of primary emphasis on households themselves to try to clean up our act as a country. You know, blaming families who take one flight a year, for example, for climate change, when you've got businesses who structure their businesses so that they're flying corporate executives all over the world constantly, just seems to me to be the way that you lose the public very, very quickly. And we've got to take the public with us. So it feels to me that business has a really, really important role to play in all of this. And there are some really brilliant examples of female business leaders. I had a similar experience to Amber when I first got appointed as her shadow. I had a meeting with a round table of executives, and it was around the time that my little boy was having to travel up and down the country with me because he was a baby, and we live up north, and I was down in London by myself with no friends, no family, and it was frequently a bit of a nightmare. And he got a fever that day, so I'd run off to get him checked out by the parliamentary sponsored GP service, and then turned up late for this meeting, having dumped him, I think, with Jan Royal, who was our leader in the House of Lords, this screaming angry baby, for a few hours, and had to leave early. These all male executives were very lovely about it and very understanding. They all turned out had young kids themselves as well. But I remember thinking, where are the women in this? But actually, I look around now, and you know, Energy UK has got this incredible woman, Emma Pinchbeck. You've got Juliet Davenport at Good Energy. There's a whole host of women who are, you know, really making waves in this area. And I think perhaps, as well as the very, very good suggestion about the consumers panel, perhaps we might try and bring together a kind of women in climate leadership group that looks across all these different areas, that could start to push on this from every angle and see if we could make progress.
I think that is such a brilliant idea. That would be a wonderful legacy from this meeting and so forth. That's fantastic. Amber, some last words on that from you as well, please.
Well, just to say that transport and households are, of course, the areas that haven't been tackled yet, when many others have. Well, there's more progress to be done. And I think that government must make a conscious effort to have women involved in the household side, particularly perhaps with some quota of a panel, but I wouldn't have a separate women's panel, because I doubt it would have authority over the panel that makes decisions.
Very good point. Listen, thank you both so much for sharing your thoughts today. It's been a lovely panel. I've really enjoyed it, and I hope people have as well who've been listening in. Thank you for all of your questions. I wanted to just read out one point that Emma Bridge left. She had to leave early, so she's not here now, but it seemed to be kind of very, very characteristic of what people have been saying. She says, I have to leave for a meeting, but I just wanted to say thanks to all the panelists. Really inspiring session. Frustrating we still have so far to go. I found all three of you and your collaborative approach and inspiration as I've explored my own leadership role and style over the past few years as Chief Exec of the Community Energy England. Thanks, and keep up the excellent work. And it does just feel to me that, you know, if we could just get in there, we could sort this out. So I love the women in climate leadership. I think we should definitely do that and make sure that after a while it's just women in leadership and we're there at the table. Thank you again so much. Thanks to everybody for being part of this. Thanks to PRASEG, the all-party parliamentary group in Parliament that works on renewable energy in particular, for setting up this meeting, and look forward to speaking again soon.